Welcome to the next episode of Cloudy with a Chance of Insights, the bi-weekly podcast focusing on the Microsoft Cloud and other tech news information that we think is useful or interesting that we might have come across over the last couple of weeks. This week, myself and David, ironically, have actually picked at least one of the same topics to discuss, which will be the recent announcement or blog post from Brad Smith from Microsoft around the strategy investments for Microsoft in the cloud space in Europe. He also wants to take us down memory lane, or at least take me down memory lane, and talk about the upcoming changes around the SharePoint licensing model, which might have an implication for people using the sort of old school on-premises implementation of SharePoint. And Cyrus wants to talk about a few areas around security, including an updated MCRA, which is, if I get my acronyms correct, the Microsoft Cybersecurity Reference Architecture, which I personally find is a very valuable resource. And I always pull it out if I want to scare somebody around the complexity of cybersecurity in the Microsoft space. But anyway, Cyrus will cover that off, and I hope he will do it in a much more less scary way than I would typically leverage that resource. So without further ado, and I'm going to mention this at the start of the podcast this week instead of at the end. So if you do find what we're doing here enjoyable, interesting, beneficial, whatever adjective I can think of off the top of my head, please click the like button or the rating button if you're listening on Spotify, etc. Subscribe, follow, whatever it might well be, and comment. Please do. I mean, any feedback that we get would be appreciated and would feed back into what we do in the future. Anyway, enough of that stuff that we have to sort of get out of the way. This week has been fun-filled, I think, from my perspective. There's been a lot of stuff going on at IBM, which is, I think, interesting. So I don't know whether Cyrus and David were aware of this, but we've been running a hackathon over the last, probably 2 months around agentic AI and co-pilots around the sort of Microsoft space. For reasons I am still not entirely sure why, I was selected as one of the judges for this hackathon. And we had the judges' presentations, for want of a better word, on Monday and Tuesday of this week. First day was internal pieces, then the second day was client teams, in some instances with clients, so collaboration with clients. I'm not going to mention client names or even details around some of the things that came up, because I think those probably should be left to other mediums to talk about. But what I was very impressed with is the breadth of different solutions that the teams came up with. And bear in mind that I only saw the 20 or so that had been picked to be in the finals. And there was certainly a couple of hundred different teams that were involved in this. But even so, with that sort of smaller sort of cohort, the breadth of ideas that they were thinking of using for generative AI and agentic AI, whatever buzzword term you want to use, was very, very interesting, ranging from sort of healthcare scenarios through to, as you'd expect from an IBM one, sort of more traditional internal use cases around, code quality and migration enhancements, etc., etc. So I found that a very thought-provoking exercise. It was something that I wasn't expecting to see the quality of the response, and certainly, Cyrus, the French team or the French teams, because on the Tuesday, 6 or 7 of the 12 teams were based in France.
Oh, wow.
Was very interesting how seriously and how enthusiastically they took part in this, and how seriously they took it. So it was very, very interesting. Some of the ideas coming from that area, keep an eye out, because that might well be something that we'll be talking about in the future.
Oh,
so that was one area. The other thing that sort of came up from me from last week, and I know I sort of mentioned this on the previous podcast, was that I took about 2 or 3 hours out of my morning free time, because as people might know, I sort of work East Coast time. So I get sort of, up until about 11, 12 o'clock during the day, free in inverted commas. And then I work through to, 8, 9 o'clock at night. So I took a few hours to go to the UK Cyber Expo, or the Cyber Week Expo in Olympia last week. And I found, obviously I'm not the target person for that type of expo. It is very much focused around clients and people that work in the sort of CISO space, or within perhaps, as analysts or in procurement, whatever it might well be. So it's not really designed for partners or alliance leads, or however you want to define my role at IBM. But I did find that certainly the exhibitor stands that are there, that where I would normally be sitting on an IBM booth talking about IBM security services or IBM Microsoft partnership, whatever it might well be, was very interestingly split between people that were offering MSSP services, so managed security services. So that might well be with a SOC, might be MDR, so device management. So mobile security, device management was come up quite frequently. Through to security sort of organizations. So there was an interesting one there that was working with the police force, for example, to promote good practices around cybersecurity. So like a little bit like a community type effort to, promote, or what's the word I'm looking for? Enhance the visibility of cybersecurity, the importance of cybersecurity within the sort of small businesses, but also with end users. And we talked about this the other day, sort of with the SME market and perhaps home users not being as well covered in terms of a tooling perspective or even an education perspective. Through to some areas that we sort of talked about when we talked about the cyber range the other day, and I had a really good, interesting conversation with a company that looked like they'd taken the whole sort of sentiment analysis piece that was very popular about, 7 to 10 years ago in the sort of Twitter and Facebook space, to look and say, oh, look, your company X is getting a lot of negative, comments on Twitter, or X as it is now. You might want to think about that. But they sort of flip that to look at it from a cyber space. So either to look at it as an intelligence piece, saying, okay, look, we've got a lot of chatter over here about your company coming from this particular segment, which means that you perhaps should be a little bit more worried going forward about what's going on. But also as a sort of crisis management tool. So after potentially a breach, and we look at what's happening with M&S in the UK, so Marks and Spencer's in the UK, a lot of negative press around their recent cyber incident they've suffered. And I think yesterday or the day before, again, another sort of retail organization in the UK is preemptively, I say preemptively, it's not quite right, but they understood they were undergoing a cyber incident, and they started to shut things down as a sort of a protection mechanism. But you can see that even just the standard press like the BBC, Guardian, Telegraph, Times, etc., that those negative headlines are coming up. And that has a wider impact in the confidence of the consumers, because both of these are retail organizations or in retail spaces. So it was an interesting and perhaps timely conversation around that. And I must admit, I'm going to have to go away probably next week sometime and actually go and revisit the cyber range that IBM offer and the crisis piece there to see actually, are we doing this? Because I know that when I was going back that 7-10 years, yes, we had a whole division looking at sort of sentiment analysis as a sort of sales and / marketing tool. But in theory, we should have actually taken that on board and said, actually, this is part of our incident response service. I don't know whether it is. It probably is. I've never really looked into it, but it's something that I'm going to take away as a action on my ever-growing action list that I have here. Anyway. Enough around that, and enough of me talking for a little while. David, how about you?
And I was going to say, I might go off script quickly, because I just realised the elephant in the room that we absolutely haven't spoken about is our nice shiny new Microsoft practice. Yes. And I can't believe we all forgot about it. So.
Well, I was deliberately not mentioning it because I think you know, and I think the listeners know that I do try and avoid talking too much about IBM, even though I've just gone off on one about IBM products and services, because we're not sanctioned by IBM.
We're not. But it is all over LinkedIn, so it counts as news, Richard, I reckon.
Absolutely. So again, just to clarify, all three of us currently work for IBM, both Cyrus and David in the UK. I'm obviously UK based, but I have a global role. So, David, do you want to follow up with the announcement with a bit more
absolutely.
information?
So, been I guess a few years coming now. So we've had a core group of Microsofties. You've got some of us here. There's more, obviously, in IBM. And we've been working to obviously bring all the goodness that Microsoft brings into IBM. And as with any large organization, those sort of things take a bit of time. And recently, with our recent moves, with Mohammed coming in, that recognition of the value and the power of the Microsoft partnership brings, they have now formalized what we do into a practice, which is absolutely amazing because we now have the mandate to be really irritating about Microsoft things, and I love it.
And for someone that's been at IBM for a little bit longer, and again, probably too much personal information for something that's going out on a public area, but I've been at IBM now for 10 years across 2 stints. I did spend a little bit of time with Wipro. For anybody who's been on my LinkedIn profile, you'll all know this anyway. But when I was at IBM 10 years or so ago, there was still a core sort of Microsoft focus there, but it was very much a niche area and was only really called upon if a client really demanded that we do something on a Microsoft stack. So that announcement is from someone who's seen that sort of beginning journey to where we are now is really, 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 really good news. And I'm really hopeful for what we're going to be able to achieve now coming up in the future because of that extra focus. And credit to people like Chris McGuire, Mihar, even I was going to say even the leadership, but Neil Dahl coming involved, who's driving this, Muhammad Ali, for example. I think it's really, really important that we have that focus around the Microsoft stack because I keep saying this internally, but you can't have a cloud conversation with a client without talking about Microsoft.
Especially
it's almost impossible. There are some organizations, and I think Airbus is one of them, that is almost entirely not Microsoft stack. But that they are the outliers. It is a fact, and I know that there are organisations, and we might well mention this in relation to one of the other posts that are sort of against that sort of position. But it is where we are at the moment to a certain extent. Yeah, there is competition, but Microsoft has its at least a finger in almost every pie.
And the LinkedIn article is also really well written. At the end, it shows all the IBM technology on the Microsoft Azure, and also in IBM now, a unified team of 33,000 certified professionals. That number blew my mind, honestly. Exciting news.
Yeah. Again, for someone who's been working in the IBM sphere for as long as I have, it's actually really interesting how big the Microsoft aligned, for want of a better word, talent is within IBM. And we've, take away the last 2 years as an organization, we just haven't been very good at promoting that externally. And I still get, sometimes even internally, I'll be honest with you, sometimes I get, oh, by the way, we partner with Microsoft. I didn't know that. And that's something that Chris, Mihar, Matt Porter from the Americas before he retired, Tim Callahan in the UK, for example, very sort of focused on changing that narrative over the last 2 to 3 years. And this is the latest step, and long may it continue.
Absolutely. So, bit of a digression. Sorry, but I felt worthy. It was worthy news, Richard.
And I think I covered the disclaimer that we all work for IBM. 2 of us at least are ex-Microsoft, but this is not a sponsored viewpoint from IBM or Microsoft. So all views are our own, etc., etc., etc. So there you go. I think I've covered at least mine behind. And we can move on to the next topic.
And as Richard said, there's a blog post that Brad Smith released on the 30th, which was yesterday, and he's announced a set of 5 new European digital commitments So obviously, with all the geopolitical challenges, is that the right phrase, that's going on at the moment, there's, I guess, a lot of concern, certainly in Europe and worldwide, around, well, what happens if something happens with the US. So Microsoft appear to be doubling down on helping, I guess, people understand where they're going, what they're driving, how they're going to support Europe's vision of, I'm not going to say sovereignty, but the making sure that data stays in Europe and not going to be subject to people trying to look at it. So they're in doing that, he's created 5 new digital commitments. I'm going to read them out. So one of them's about building broad AI and cloud ecosystem across Europe. They're doing that anyway right now, but there's a bit more that sits behind that. Upholding digital resilience. So that's the piece I was just talking about now. Protect the privacy of European data. Protect and defend Europe's cybersecurity, which obviously close to Richard's heart, and strengthen economic competitiveness. And I think part of this is they're, again, and they've said this a few years ago, but they're explicitly acknowledging that digital sovereignty is, I guess, no longer an optional thing, right? It's a baseline that European governments, businesses are articulating, demanding even, I suppose. And they also want, excuse me, more transparency, control, and local governance over that local digital infrastructure. They're expanding the EU Data Boundary Initiative to help reinforce those customer rights to choose where data is stored and processed. And then this piece about investment in local data centers is more than just local data centers, because we know we have lots and lots of regional data centers. But in this instance, I think there's a doubling down on the actual sovereign data centers. So Richard and I were talking about this earlier. Germany is a good example where you've got a data center that's owned, managed, and run entirely by German staff, German people. It's almost, I'm going to say, almost a standalone instance of Azure, so similar to Gov. So that way, there's ultimate control. Now, with that, you seed some things, like you might not necessarily get the updates as quickly as public Azure, but I think that's a trade-off that many countries would probably be willing to have access to that hyperscale capability, but maybe just slightly behind the curve on adoption. And then we've spoken previously, and if you want to do that locally on your organization, then you've got Azure Local to do that, and then that's even further behind the curve because it's not hyperscale, it's a subset of Azure. So really, really interesting things. And I thought one worthy of a conversation. Richard, what's your take on it?
I think that, I mean, reading the post, I'll put a link in the show notes, and it is quite a long read, and there's a lot of information in there. But I certainly think that the sovereign cloud, or at least I'm not sure what the right phrase to use would be, but certainly perhaps a slightly more independent instance within a country, whether that's the UK, France, Germany, wherever it might well be, is something that organizations are going to be pushing for, and not just central government, but things that might be CNI or critical national infrastructure for anybody that might not know or recognize that acronym. So I think that's a good move. I think that there's a couple of other announcements in there as well that are interesting. So I think there's like a doubling of the data center capacity across Europe. Now, some of that's obviously going to be driven by the AI adoption that they're seeing. Although I don't know about anybody else, but I'm getting some mixed messages around their scaling for AI. There was an article a couple of weeks ago that said they'd actually dropped some of the leases in the US that they'd committed to build out data center capacity. But I'm trying to do a proof of concept internally, and I'm using the West US 3 region, which is probably one of the newer ones and possibly not with the greatest capacity. But I couldn't deploy Linux workloads into that subscription. So obviously, we are having to look at how we scale that underlying infrastructure. And if we can have instances that are dedicated and isolated in some ways to a particular country or region, that is only going to help with some of the different rules and privacy concerns that we have.
Yeah, and it's interesting on that AI thing. I noticed a tweet from Satya. I'm probably not going to be able to find it now, but he was essentially saying that they are doubling the performance of models every whatever it is. So I think what they're doing, obviously they're optimizing and getting faster at the same time. So they're able to do more with the same compute. I think if you look at, I guess, some of the lessons learned from DeepSeek and others, right, where they've done really incredible job with a relatively small amount of hardware, and that started to sink in, I think. So whereas it was, we need masses of hardware to do all of this. Actually, people are now, okay, well, how can we optimize this, make better use? And then you've got that AI curve, which is then, a bit like Moore's law, right? It keeps improving. So I think there's that might be behind some of that mixed messaging, because the massive commitments to build out Reams data centers. But if you suddenly can discover that you can squish down the performance and squeeze more out what you got, well, yeah, because they're significant, right? Those investments, Richard, they're pretty substantial.
They are, and you make a good point. And I think that at the moment, and I'm basing this off of other information that I've heard, and I don't have to hand at the moment, but I don't think that OpenAI, for example, at the moment is making a profit. I think every query that we make in ChatGPT is in effect costing them money, and that's because we need to try and get that sort of performance level related to cost. And if Microsoft have discovered a way, and I haven't seen the post you're talking about, so I'll go and have a look for that afterwards. Yeah, so if Microsoft are making that much more efficient, then that is only going to help them both in terms of the data capacity sort of planning and scaling, but also in terms of actually how you cost and charge for that. Going back to the security space, security Copilot. Oh, it looks like David's found the article.
I have. So it's a tweet. He's done it on LinkedIn. I spotted as well. So verbatim, we are writing multiple compounding S-curves in pre-training, influence time, and systems design, driving model performance that is doubling every 6 months. So then talk about Azure being the infrastructure layer for AI, optimize across every layer, silicon, blah, blah, blah. So essentially what they're saying is, again, word for word, we are delivering more performance per megawatt, lower cost per token, and faster dock to live times. So you take that in the context of the conversation we're just having now, right? That you can see where maybe some of those withdrawals on massive investments.
Absolutely. And there was one thing that, again, myself and David talked about this before we started the recording, is there was a piece in there that stood out for me, and it wasn't around cybersecurity or around data center expansion, sovereign clouds, etc. Although it's sort of related to sovereign clouds, I suppose. And this is because there is an ongoing court case, which I can't remember the name of it or what's the specifics, but AWS and Google are certainly involved. And they're complaining that Microsoft have different licensing terms for some of the Microsoft software if they run on AWS or Google, and they're saying that's anti-competitive, etc. I'm not going to get involved in the rights and wrongs of that one, but there is a paragraph in that blog post called "Support for European Cloud Providers," and it does say a third aspect of our work, and I'm reading this verbatim, involves a collaboration with European providers to offer Microsoft applications and services on their local cloud infrastructure. So it doesn't really say what that is. I don't know whether that means you're going to be, using some other cloud providers' infrastructure to run Windows Virtual Desktop or similar pieces. Anyway, on their own local cloud infrastructure, the partnership provides these European providers with the opportunity to run Microsoft applications on more favorable terms than we make available to Amazon and Google, specifically calling out those two organizations. We are developing new technology and licensing solutions tailored for these European providers and the markets they serve, which I thought was a really interesting paragraph. It's buried about, probably about a third of the way through the the blog post, but I read that and I had to sort of have a slight smile as I was going through that. So it'll be interesting to see what that means, and whether we're going to start to see hosted Windows from some of the other sort of smaller, it's probably very unfair cloud providers.
Yeah.
Okay, so Cyrus, any thoughts on what we've just sort of elaborated? And I'm sure you will actually be able to pronounce the Project Blue or whatever it's called from Capgemini much better than me or David.
No, I didn't know that, so I was really passively listening, and I was really interested by the conversation. Not a lot of insights apart from when David was talking about optimization, a better cost per token used. It's not an interesting insight, but the only thing that came to my mind was an article I saw that the OpenAI was asking people to remove some words and not say thank you because they were scared of like the AI take over the world. So don't say thank you because it costs millions. I thought it was a fake news, but actually it was real news. So now when I hear the perspective of David shared, this is more interesting than don't say thank you to the AI. No, it's nothing more to share. Huh? I'm going to read the article to be fair, because I have a FOMO now.
You might want to get an AI agent to summarize it for you. It is a very long, well, not very long, but it is long. It's not. Some of these releases, I'm terrible at this sort of stuff anyway. Again, shouldn't admit this on the podcast probably, that I really am terrible at reading these types of things, because it's like, oh, for goodness sake, seriously, 2 pages of sort of marketing waffle around things. But it's interesting to see they sort of commit their commitment to the European market. Now, whether this would have happened anyway, or whether this is a reaction to something that's going on, who knows? But we'll see.
When you say take an agent, I was counting on that. And for people who have dyslexia like me, when there's such a long article, I have to summarize it. And of course, that's one of my prompts. Remove all the marketing. I use a different word, but all the marketing fluff. And it works really well.
I'm again really ashamed to admit it. I need to start getting better at using some of the AI tools that we have available to us to do some of this. I might have actually said this beforehand, but we've got, some of us are lucky enough to have Copilot or M365 Copilot licenses. And I continually ask it to rewrite some of my emails, because I look at my emails and I go, Richard, you sound like a complete and utter on this email. So I get it to rewrite it and I go, well, I don't actually like what it's done there. I've reverted back to my original grumpy email. But there you go. That's just me. Right. So the next topic is taking me back down memory lane, for want of a better word. So when I was at Microsoft, I was part of the SharePoint team at Microsoft. So we actually had, I can't remember how big the team was, but we actually had a little corner in one of the buildings in Thames Valley Park, or TVP, that was called SharePoint Corner. And that was sort of where we proudly sat, all our SharePoint nerds and goodness. So shout out to people like Mark and Paul Grimley and James and the whole team that I think some of at least a good proportion of them are still at Microsoft as well. So congrats to them, and a shout out to the old SharePoint Corner world. Anyway, David, do you want to explain why I've just gone off on a tangent about SharePoint?
Yeah, I again, by chance, I spotted a conversation about SharePoint Server, and SharePoint Server 2019 is going out of extended support in July 26. I was like, ooh, that's interesting, because that's not a lot of time. When you think about, certainly, Richard, you and I have seen organizations with terabytes and terabytes of data sitting in SharePoint, with some quite complicated configuration sat behind them. Some for good reasons, some, why did you do that? But they are where they are. And people have obviously been diligently, I guess, upgrading for some time now. And as it goes out support, you now have 2 options. You have SharePoint subscription, or you've got SharePoint Online. And the whole SharePoint subscription thing completely passed me by, and I feel ashamed to say, well, I never really did like SharePoint, to be honest, Richard. It was more of an exchange man. But anyway.
Wow.
But I was like, ooh, that a year to plan and upgrade, if the decision is actually we don't want to be doing this on premises anymore, that's not a lot of time in my mind for some of these environments. So I thought it'd be useful for people just to highlight it, but also to take Richard on memory lane and see what you thought about it.
SharePoint. Now, I'm going to probably alienate most of the listeners and viewers of this. I still really like SharePoint. I think SharePoint is an amazing piece of technology. And by the way, underpins most of Teams. So again, regardless of what you think of Teams or not, basically Teams is, in my opinion, is a skin on top of a lot of the SharePoint framework. Same with OneDrive. And almost every organization has an instance of SharePoint. And yes, there used to be a phrase back when I was at Microsoft that said something, okay, if you wanted to hide something, stick it in SharePoint and no one will ever find it ever again. Which I always thought was a bit unfair. True, probably, but mostly because of the way people implemented SharePoint, not necessarily because of technology. And coming back to one of David's points around this is that people used to use SharePoint for things it wasn't designed for. And I'll go back to a project a few years ago, actually quite a long time ago. Again, C&I project. I won't mention names or anything else, but it was basically a massive rules engine. And somebody somewhere, wasn't an IBMer, I will put it out, it was not an IBMer, although it was when I was at IBM, came up with the idea of doing this in SharePoint. And long story short, IBM took over the project and it was like, why are we doing this on SharePoint? There are so many better tools for doing this. And I'm sure David probably thought of the one straight off the top of his head for doing rules engines at that particular time. BizTalk would have been a perfect solution for that. But no, somebody said we're going to do this in SharePoint. That solution would never, ever get migrated to the cloud. And I've never looked at the SharePoint subscription model because obviously I've moved away from that when the subscription model was announced, which was, I don't know, about 3 or 4 years ago, I think, off the top of my head. So I don't know whether there's any constraints around that. I'd imagine there is, which means that you probably can't move those types of solutions there as well. So if you've got, and
exactly,
it's probably not unusual for organizations to have relatively important either document repositories or processes or even applications sat within a SharePoint farm on-prem that won't go as is into SharePoint Online or into the subscription model. I am guessing about the subscription model, so I might have to do some reading and come back and change this. So that's the sort of custom sort of dev and solution element of SharePoint, which again, SharePoint was great for, but people abused that, in my opinion. Then to the thing where SharePoint is just basically a massive document store, where people shove every single type of document or content that they can think of in SharePoint. Now, whilst that can move, you've then got the issue of having, X number of terabytes of data or whatever it might well be, that you have to go and classify, you have to go and identify what it is. Is it business related data or is it just somebody storing their holiday photos in SharePoint, which, hands up, I've done. I don't know about anybody else, but I certainly have done that sort of stuff with personal stuff in, a SharePoint instance. Yeah. And those become big problems. And even going back to when it was fairly common to do a migration from on-prem into SharePoint. So, file shares into OneDrive or, SharePoint 2013 to Office 365. And we had things like, what was that called? I think it was called, was it called CAF or something? It was like SharePoint Adoption Framework or something like that, which came out with 2013, which is basically how you build your SharePoint farms to make it simple to migrate to 2013. I can't remember what that was called.
Remember that.
But it was all about sort of individual site collections and no sort of code at a certain level. It was all sort of web app type codes and basically moving as much of that to sort of apps that were hosted as opposed to sort of hooked into the SharePoint binaries, etc.
Yeah.
So you just look at the content. Those are big tasks, and they always were. So that's going to be interesting to see what people do with that. Because quite frankly, if you're going to go down a subscription model, unless there's something on there that you can't put into the cloud, and that's becoming less and less likely now, I think, with the controls, especially now that you might potentially have, a sovereign M365 instance. Potentially, it's not called out in the Brad Smith post, but you do have it in the US. That you will start to move that to Office 365, because if you're paying a subscription for on-prem, you might as well pay the subscription for Office 365 in my mind. Yeah. So then we end up having to revisit that whole SharePoint migration piece that I actually thought we'd sort of dead and buried years ago.
Sorry.
Well, you would think that anybody that was going to make that move would have already have done it.
You would
Especially
think so,
considering, probably most organizations, I would imagine 90+% of organizations must be running Exchange Online now. And you tended to do those things at the same time. So you'd sort of do the mailboxes, and then you might well do the SharePoint, you might do a file share to OneDrive, etc. So you're actually having to go back to those processes and go, well, actually, hang on a second, we've got this old SharePoint file, we've got all this content in there. Some of it we can't do anything about. So what we're going to do with that, we're going to modernize it and put it into Azure or somewhere else. And then the content, you sort of go, oh no, I thought we'd dealt with this. And you have to reopen all those playbooks, all those sort of projects, plans and methodologies, all that adoption piece that you thought you didn't have to worry about anymore. So,
and I think the interesting thing there is some of that's been lost to the mists of time, right? It wasn't that long ago, but you look at, a lot of the articles and blog posts and everything probably would have gone by now, because for that exact reason. So it will be interesting, I think, to see it progress, and with the essentially it's a year and a couple of months, right?
Yeah.
To action it, right? I'm not talking about making a decision. Goes end of support next year in June. So, people at the very worst, hopefully, people will. This will prompt people to think about it, right?
So you say this again. I think you both know that I have, and it's been up for years and years. I've got a blog post that I intermittently go, I'm going to do some stuff on the blog, and I blog for a month or so, and then I get does something and I forget, and then I go back. But I was looking at the stats the other day, and I shared this with Nigel when I was chatting with him about something. I can't remember what it was. So I pulled up the stats for like the month's traffic to the blog site, and most of it was the stuff that you'd expect to be there. Show notes for this, some of the newsletter content I've been writing recently. But I had 3 people go on to a post that I'd done about document libraries in SharePoint 2010. And I'm like, seriously? Are people still looking at articles about how to use document libraries in SharePoint 2010? 14, 15 years after that product had been released. So it's interesting, because I got and this is when I kicked it off. There's scripts in there for doing things like iterating through user accounts in PowerShell. That still regularly gets people hitting that page on a weekly basis. I'm like, okay, so there must be people out there with SharePoint 2013, 2010 that are still having to look at these things. So, and that would be my worry. That's the digression, is that people will say, well, actually, it's end of support. We're going to keep running it. We're just going to keep it there. We're not going to do anything. It's out of support. We'll just maintain it, whatever it is. Exactly. But then you just end up with it being either a piece of legacy, tech debt that you never do anything with, but potentially it also becomes a vector. And that's something that you really do have to seriously consider.
That's actually a scary news, David. Because as you said, there's projects that can't be migrated and they will stay here as a legacy. And I know some company who are actively saying that they will not migrate to SharePoint Online. They have different solutions for documentation. For what they bespokely created on SharePoint, there's no way they will move that. So, and the thing I heard sometimes, but if it's on premise, if it's secured, it's controlled, there's no danger. So. No
Your
comment.
moat is not what you think it is. Indeed.
So that was the trip down memory lane, and I would certainly have more hair now if it wasn't for some of those SharePoint projects and migrations that I was involved in at the time.
So you should have done Exchange. You kept your hair.
Weirdly, I don't know whether you know, I am actually Exchange certified as well. So,
I wanted to say, do you want to share your score?
No.
I am one of the weirdest Microsoft certified people out there, because I've got certifications. I mean, some of them are expired now, so it doesn't really matter. But obviously, SharePoint, Exchange, Office 365, Azure, Windows Communication Foundation. I'm certified in Windows Communication Foundation. So WCF for the people in the know. So weird Dynamics. I had certifications in Dynamics. So when the breadth, not very much depth, a lot of breadth. So I don't know what that would be in the sort of T-shaped, pie-shaped consultant. It'd be like a line down I-shaped consultant.
I was going to say, before we leave, you mentioned BizTalk. It was probably something we ought to pick up in a different session, I think, because that's another one that's destined for the guillotine as well, isn't it? So,
but they've been trying to kill BizTalk for years. Before I joined Microsoft, I worked for an organization called SolidSoft, who I think is still going. They're now called SolidSoft Reply or Reply something. They're still going, and they were basically a BizTalk house. And every couple of months, we'd get rumors that Microsoft were trying to kill BizTalk. But it's like that thing that never dies. It still sort of lives on in the background. You know, it's supposed to be replaced by sort of enterprise service bus architecture. Microservices were sort of things that would sort of kill it. But the orchestration and sort of rules management within BizTalk is obviously something that people still rely on.
Yeah.
And to prove that when you become a Microsoft partner, because you can see the software they give when you pay the different kind of action pack, gold, whatever version, and you can be surprised that Microsoft every year or every 2 years remove some apps, add some apps. For example, now they offer some Microsoft Copilot licenses when you take the biggest version. But BizTalks is in all the versions, surprisingly enough.
Yeah.
But that is a modernization opportunity for Microsoft in terms of the product set, but also for organizations, because that there must be more effective ways of doing some of that sort of old BizTalk workloads now.
Yeah.
But
maybe
as you said,
next time.
Sorry, David. Yes,
I was going to say I'll pick that up next time, maybe.
Yeah, excellent. So I think that I've got no idea what the running time that we've got at the moment, because I've got the Riverside in a minimized window. But I think it's probably time to move on to Cyrus, who had a couple of different sort of smaller bite-sized chunks that he wanted to talk through.
It's not as interesting as the discussion we had, but I just want to jump on something you said, Richard, before about the Microsoft Cybersecurity reference architecture. You said you wanted to scare clients with some of the slides, and I used to do that by unintentionally. So for those who don't know, it's done by Mark Simos. He works for Microsoft since more than 20 years in the cybersecurity field, and it's basically a massive document. It's honestly the best document on cybersecurity that Microsoft produced. There is like mapping, there is like processes. You have all the technologies. On the human resource, how to create a team in cybersecurity, how to create a SOC with the Microsoft mindset, how an attack is carried on. It's a comprehensive documentation. The tradition is that it's updated every 2 years. And no matter what happens with Microsoft, for example, when we had the Azure AD renaming to Entra ID, it was a massive change, but didn't trigger that documentation to be like renewed. So it was every December, December 2021, December 2023, and we all expected December 2025 for the updated version. But surprisingly enough, it happened last week, and there's a lot of change. So I was a bit surprised to read the updates. because it doesn't feel like there's a lot of news, but actually there is, because they could not map all the naming, but there's obviously naming change, but also a lot of capability from Microsoft Security Copilot, and that could not wait 2025 because there's a lot of news. So yeah, so there's a mapping on all the Microsoft Copilot for security in most of the pages. Few things, for example, passkeys. So we now happily we have the passkeys included in those slides. Windows Labs, the exposure management, Microsoft Security exposure management. A lot of information about that. Entra ID, verified ID. That's kind of new on GA. What else? But my experience with this the MCRA is the same as what Richard earlier shared. Is when you share, especially there's one slide with all the technology mapping.
Mm-hmm.
So all the maps of Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, XDR, then you have like sub tabs, and you have cloud, and it's going in all the direction. And usually it's a binary reaction you have with clients. Is either you trigger a sense of awe, and like it's a feeling of absolute awe. They want you to change the slides immediately, or a sense of wonder. And that happened to me when I was more like a enthusiast with Linux type defense, or like more popular old school defense. And actually show you when you have one single license with Microsoft, you don't know you have most of those little piece of technology that all interacts, and it's like a beautiful ballet with like every piece is important. So there's also something I noticed in the change. There's a better mapping on technology and process and resource. Yeah, so that's you can see on the website the change. Now,
as soon as we've finished recording, I'm going to go and jump into that deck and see if I can get to the slide that I think we're both talking about. And I just use that to show the interconnectivity of all the different tools and the areas that the clients or organizations have to consider. And it doesn't, again, being agnostic here, it doesn't mean that you have to go and put Defender and Entra and Sentinel, etc. into your solutions, but they are areas that you need to have a strategy for. And it is amazing when you look at that slide, and I'll see if I can find it, and I'll flash it up onto screen so people know what I'm talking about here. But it just shows that the wide breadth that you have to consider, not just as a security professional, but actually, I think more importantly, as someone who's looking at either the infra or the apps pieces of the estates as well. Because you have to think about, okay, hang on a second, how am I going to integrate that? So that slide is a really, really important slide, I think. As I said, I'll grab it and I'll stick it and I'll try and flash it up, or I'll put a link into the show notes. But anyway, enough. Back to you, Cyrus.
No, absolutely, and it's also important for architects. Doesn't matter if it's security, because we don't know if security should be independent or part of the like a more mindset of shift left. This slide is also interesting because you have so many buttons you can click. So every piece of technology you can click on, it opens the official Microsoft documentation, and that triggers always conversation with clients. Always. That's why it's the most important slide, because you can then say, okay, the strategy IBM has, which I agree recently, it's if a client has a Microsoft 365 license, normally you suggest to leverage that, and by default. And then if they want something like a different tool, etc., you can see what gap you have. And then you have the author's slides, for example, attack path, which is my favorite, because you can see 2 attacks, internal and external, and you have the technology mapping, and then you have the process, then you have the zero trust. It's a Pandora box you open, but at least there's all the slides to back that. There's a lot to say about this thing, and I think everyone who is working in cybersecurity or with different clients, or even if your client's listening, you open that thing. You don't need to be an architect for that. It's just like, it's intuitive. There's for me, this slide should be pay as you go. It should not be free. Sorry, no, I should not say that. So there's also quick news that there's plenty of news every week with Microsoft, but those ones looks small, but are interesting enough as when you connect the dots. One of them is custom naming templates for Android enterprise devices in Intune. So that's the Intune thing. And for a long time, Android device work profile is not supported anymore since recently, I think. So there is some change, but why that is important is we had to manually rename devices when they were enrolled. And usually it's not really done. So you have like Android device 001 and stuff. And we had discussion about what is the device for when you have the Intune dashboard and you have to use third-party tool to map the serial number to CMDB. So it's all complex, but now natively you can do the same process as for PC, Mac, etc. And you can just do a template based on the user serial number. And you have, like, for example, names like NYC for New York City, sales 01 or John or this kind of thing. So interesting. There is also news that is in between security and Intune. These two. One of them is recently we've seen Apple devices, Apple Intelligence, and there's an AI tool from Apple that does. It's a bit like Recall and can do some screenshots, help you to do some screenshots for remembering or asking advice about what you see on your screen. And lucky enough, on Intune now you have an option to automatically block that. If you have managed device and you don't want your user to play that with corporate data, you have like an approach to block that. Another one is we talk about hot patch for server, but there's a hot patch update for Windows 11 Enterprise, and it's enabled now, and it works. So you can activate it through Intune, and your users, if you work in SMB or you have critical assets, you have like literally the patch that can be done without restarting the device, which is massive because we know that we don't really restart. And for me personally, I have a Mac in IBM because I don't like to restart my device. And I know on Windows, when you don't restart, like after 3 days, it starts to be clunky. There's bugs, there's RAM issue. So that's a good thing for
and that really interesting, right, Cyrus? Because I was looking at that, and Server Enterprise hot patching free. Server other versions of Server is like $1 something, $1.50 per server. Like, ooh, that's quite a lot. It'd be interesting to see whether you have to pay for the client as well.
It's a good question. I don't think you have, but it's worth checking.
Yeah. I thought that was really interesting when I read it because I hadn't clicked. I just thought, oh, that's amazing tech. And they've gone, yes, but you have to pay for it if you're not using Enterprise.
for the server, it's true. For the server, it's true. I'll share I have the link. I'll share with Richard. So you should post it here, and the audience will have the answer. But that's something I haven't checked, unfortunately. On the security side, there's plenty. It's exclusively, so I'm going to focus on few. Is the Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps. You have now a new application tab, and you can check all the OAuth. I can't say that word. It's a word that is, I think, anti-French. No, I don't think any French can say the word OAuth, authentication. So I apologize for that. And you can see all these type of application that use this type of connection, and you have like a single pane of glass, unified view. Also, the unified portal is now GA for Defender for Cloud Apps. And so why I shared all those news is they seem to be all connected in the way that you have now a unified process, more unified views. On one particular news that was actually a bit concerning for me, but Richard, I hope you have some insight about that. I don't have it in my note, but if I remember correctly, is now when you have the unified portal between Sentinel and Defender XDR, now you can't use the Microsoft 365 alerts in Sentinel. It's exclusively visible only in the Defender portal. So, and I said that with different MVPs or security experts. I said, I think Sentinel is going to be decommissioned as a joke. It triggered bad reaction. They all like Sentinel, but it looks like from all the news that comes, maybe I read it badly, but it looks like when you do this unification, Defender wins, and Sentinel is just a repository for the blind spots for the servers. But at the end of the day, the one that is the superstar is the Defender portal.
Yeah. Let me be very clear here. I have no insights into this whatsoever. It's not come up in any calls that I've had with Microsoft around this. However, if you look at the trajectory with Defender XDR, for example, versus Sentinel, I would not at all be surprised if they ended up being merged into one product. Whether that's just a naming piece or anything else, it wouldn't surprise me at all.
I would personally like it, but all the person I used to talk to and who have better knowledge than me, more experience, they don't like that. They say, no. Sentinel will stay, and I hope it will stay. It will be a stupid decision, etc. But I don't know. I like the unification. I like the simplicity. So, I mean, that's I digress. One thing also for the Microsoft is on the OAuth part, you have also now the automatic attack disruption. I'm not sure if I discussed about that before, but automatic attack disruption is honestly the cherry on the cake on the Microsoft the security. It's you don't have to pay. It's literally part of like if you need E5, but it's a tool that you basically, as the name says, automatically block an attack based on insights, even if you don't have a policy in place, if you don't have everything. And one of the requirements for a lot of companies who use that will say, okay, it works really well, is to be able to exclude some servers, because if you have the AD server that is identified as a threat that is blocked, you block the company. So now it's like it's done. You have the possibility to exclude critical asset, which is great, but also dangerous, because if you exclude, then you kill the purpose of the attack disruption. But now it works basically not only with servers, but with identities. And there's no name that Microsoft shared, but they were really proud of comparing with a X solution and say, for example, these 2,000 assets with the attack disruption, automatic attack disruption, 0% penetration. For X, Y, and Z solution, they didn't want to share the name, but I think they were trying to elude, but they could not say. Half Y penetrated, 60%, 70%. So it's a simple, stupid feature that works really well and leverage all the signals.
Excellent. Thank you, Cyrus. Unfortunately, we've had to lose David for the last few minutes, work commitments, and we have massively overrun. So thank you for anybody that is still with us. Cyrus, if you've got anything else, then please feel free to continue. We can do that.
No, it was the last news. How do you say? There is like a narrative from Microsoft since few months about this unification, and it's a very good trajectory. I was afraid that things are going to continue a bit in silos. We talk about, yes, you have one license, you have all these tools, but they were all kind of independent. And I was personally pushing part of the CCP program to can we have, for example, stupid things, like even when they create a task management. So, are you going to integrate To-Do, Microsoft To-Do? I use it all the time, and I like to have one place I check all my tasks, my emails. When I flag my emails going to To-Do, etc. Are you going to use To-Do for when you assign a case in Defender to a user? And it's interesting, but not really. But I can still dream about that. I can still dream about a simple user becoming a super agent. You have access to all the it can be also dangerous, because if one user have access to everything, it's not necessarily the philosophy of the security resources. But we have to think also for the smaller team, and it's a reality. You have like few resources and they need more access. So I'm more thinking about that perspective. And yeah, that's it for me.
Excellent. So thank you, Cyrus, for that. And yes, we will put links in the show notes to the releases and updates that Cyrus mentioned, and more importantly to the MCRA as well, because that is a really good resource for anybody within the Microsoft space. But that about wraps it up for us. Again, thank you for anybody that is still with us. We've done, for us anyway, almost an hour-long episode today, and again, the people who do watch this on a regular basis know that I don't actually cut things out of the final video, so you get everything. You get all the ums, ahs, digressions, mistakes, everything. Personally, I think that makes it a little bit more real than something that's highly polished. But also it's a pain to do, and I prefer not to sit there and edit videos down to that level. So again, thank you for anybody that's still with us. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. And please feel free to like, subscribe, click notifications, rate, drop us comments, whatever it might well be. But thank you from me, and we will see you again in 2 weeks' time.